It's Wednesday, December the 6th. Lake level's about 913 3/4. Been generating, water pretty steady. It's going down a little bit. Wouldn't hurt my feelings if it went down about another 8 to 10 feet. I like when it gets real low in the wintertime. But the water temperature, this weekend, it still hadn't cooled down very much. It's 57 to 60 degrees, but the average 57 to 58 degrees. Now, it's got cold yesterday and today. It looks like the next 5 or 6 days is going to be pretty cold. So that'll help cool it down, but we're still behind as far as the water temperature goes. But this weekend, I caught them pretty good, mainly out deep. There's still a shallow bite going, and that seems to be the best for me. Probably later in the afternoon, right before dark, has been about the best, crankbait bite for me, and then real early in the morning. And what I've been throwing is wiggle warts, rock crawlers, and then Profound Outdoors makes a bait that's just like a wiggle wart. It's kind of a knockoff off it that works real good too. But anything that runs 8 to 10 to 12 feet seems to be working. And the best colors, I'm having to mix up and throw several different colors, but crawdad patterns mainly. Most of the water's pretty clear. Even up in the James River, and that seems like where my best bite has been shallow, is up in the James River arm. Now, the deep bite is fish out on the main lake, or main river points, and main lake points, out off the gravel. There's been a lot of shad back in the creeks, and a lot of times you'll find a lot of fish and a lot of shad, but you can't get them to bite. But if you find an area that's got a lot of one or the other, sometimes you need to visit it several times throughout the day, every couple hours. A lot of the deep bite has just been a timing deal, just getting there at the right time. And I've been catching, when the fish are fairly aggressive, I've been catching them on a white jigging spoon. I'm using a 1/2 ounce and a 3/4 ounce. Doesn't really matter what brand of spoon. I use a little bit of everything, everybody's spoons. And on the slab spoon, there's not a whole lot of action to them. They just fall real fast. And I'm fishing them, pretty aggressively. Some of the fish have been real close to the bottom. Sometimes they're up there suspended. This is where your electronics is, really plays a big part in this as far as catching these fish deep. Sometimes, you'll catch them on the spoon. Once you get them fired up, you'll catch quite a few, and then the bite will die down. Or if I can find them and not get them to bite, I'll go with a slower presentation, and I'll usually use a drop shot or a little grub. And on my drop shot baits, I've been using a lot of shad type baits. This is a real tiny fluke. Danger Close makes this one. It's a little tiny swim bait. Or you can go with just an old 4-inch grub, like a Chomper's Smoke, Black Flake, or Salt and Pepper. Or a little tiny, like a 2.8 Kitech on a 1/4 ounce grub head. Now, I like to keep the little swim bait handy, because there is times, especially, seems like when the sun starts to go down, the shad and the fish have been coming up in the water column, and I've actually been able to catch some of them still on a top water, and a swim bait when they come up higher. And that's also when the crankbait bite has been best for me, like I said earlier, late in the day. But, the fish are kind of grouping up. If you catch fish in an area one day, catch them pretty good, and you go back out there and you don't see any shad, a lot of times these fish are sucking real tight to the bottom. And even though there's no bait out there, if you'll pick that spoon up and start fishing it right off the bottom, and this has been working in a lot of different depths, but most of mine have been coming 35 to almost 50 foot deep. And I've just got to, roam around out there on some of these flats and points till I mark a couple fish. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just keep idling back and forth, and I'll set a waypoint. If I'm not finding a big group of fish, I'll set individual waypoints where I've seen 2 fish or 3 fish. Then I'll go back on the trolling motor and fish them. And a lot of times if you can get one hook, then you'll see several fish come up off the bottom. A lot of the fish are staying in the same areas, but when the bait is present, they may get a little bit more active and you'll see them. But if the bait's not there, a lot of times you'll see them right down there dead on the bottom. Now, the fish that have been in the creeks, a lot of them have been suspended around timber. Might be 60 or 70 feet deep, but the fish have been suspended anywhere from 30 to 45 feet deep in them treetops. And that bite's just going to get better and better as that water cools down. And crankbait bite should, you know, if the water will keep cooling down till we get into, you know, till we get below 50 degrees, the crankbait bite will be real good. And the jerkbait bite will start to pick up. I haven't been throwing an Alabama rig, but Alabama rig should be working as well. Now, a lot of these, since we started doing this question and answer segment, a lot of you guys have been sending, you know, a bunch of really good questions, and I've been trying to do 2 or 3 on each fishing report, so I'm going to do a few here right now. And, see, this is from Bill. He says, Pete, now that we are moving into the deep bite, I would like to hear how to use the ice jig. How do you work it? I've caught fish jigging it, and I've caught them just letting it set. What is the best way to work the ice jig compared to the spoon? Well, versus the spoon, a lot of times on the spoon, I'll do a real aggressive jerk where I'm moving the bait, snapping it up 3 to 4 feet. And the ice fishing jig, I usually fish it a little bit more like a drop shot because it's got a lot different action than a spoon. Where the slab spoon, I think the fish, a lot of the bite is just reaction because the bait is moving so fast. Where with the ice jig, it's kind of got a back and forth moment, you know, action to it. So instead of jerking it up 3 or 4 feet, a lot of times I'll just jerk it up about 1 foot or 2 and let the bait fall on a slack line where it can kind of go, you know, end to end. And, you know, a lot of times I'm more apt to fish it like a drop shot where I'll just kind of shake it a little bit and let it set. And, you know, there's even times where I'll fish a spoon like that too. There's times that they don't want that spoon fished really aggressive where you got to kind of shorten your strokes, you know, just move it a couple feet at a time, even just, you know, a few inches. A lot of times if you get a fish to follow a spoon up and then you stop and he just sits there and looks at it, what you need to do is, as that fish starts to come up off bottom right before he gets to your, whether it's a spoon or an ice fishing jig or a drop shot, is start your retrieve up to keep the fish moving. A lot of times if they stop and look at it and go back down, I don't know whether they get too good a look at it or what, but it seems like when they do that a couple times, I'll just keep reeling the bait up so the fish doesn't stop and look at it. Sometimes that'll get you, you know, an extra fish or 2. But as far as the ice fishing jig, you kind of got to let the fish dictate to you how they want it. I'll try several different things, but it's, you know, compared to the spoon, it's almost like finesse fishing a spoon, you know, more towards the drop shot. See, we got the next question. It says, my question, this is from M-A-J-K, Micah, I guess. But his question is, why in the fall is 55-degree water temperature so important in the Ozark Lakes? And what are the best baits and targets to target bass in this water temperature? Is that when the shad start to die and move into the creeks? Well, we're at 57, 58 degrees, and a lot of the baits already moved back into the creeks. As far as why I think that's a key temperature, is I think a lot of the largemouth will move up shallow through that 55 to 50 degree water temperature and feed up pretty heavy, you know, for the winter, before that water gets too cold. And a lot of the best baits, I think, are crankbaits. Sometimes it's spinner baits, but it's, you know, it's reaction baits, faster moving baits. Sometimes if you don't have the right conditions for the crankbait, you can throw a jig on the same type of banks that you're fishing a crankbait. And now the type of banks, a lot of them will be kind of like what I would fish in the spring, pre-spawn banks. And, you know, these fish will be in rock transition, usually wherever a channel in the creek comes up against the point or the bank, and where your rock goes from like football size to pea gravel. The same type of stuff that you would target in the springtime. And as far as when the shad die, we haven't had a cold winter for several years, but normally that water temperature's got to get below 50 degrees for the shad start to die. And that's when I think the jerkbait bite can get really good, as long as you're in an area where there's not too many shad dying. Okay. Says this is from Chris. Once the fish are in their winter pattern, with many of them suspended, I see people using swim baits, A-rigs, float and fly. Is one of these or another more consistent in my experience? Well, it depends on how deep the fish is suspended. I think anytime, especially in the wintertime when it's real cold, I won't use a swim bait that much unless I'm fishing a tournament that doesn't allow an A-rig. An A-rig seems to work so much better than a swim bait, because you've got 4 or 5 swim baits out there, only 3 of them with hooks. But the A-rig seems to catch a lot bigger fish. And when they suspend like that, you just try to figure out what depth they key on, what depth the fish is suspending at, and you try to get your Alabama rig or your swim bait down at that depth and keep it at that level. But something about that A-rig seems to trigger big fish, especially in the real cold water. Now, as far as the float and fly, I like that when the water's extremely cold. And like I say, the last couple winters, there hadn't been a real good float and fly bite because the water's just barely got below 50. But when that water is in the like 45 to 47 degrees, that's when I think that float and fly works the best. And normally when that bite is working good, you'll see some shad dying and kind of spinning off where they're starting to die. And when you see them real little shad along these bluffs, right in the heart of the guts, or not on the guts, but on the heart of the bluffs, not so much on the bluff ends or the bluff end points, but we fish a lot of the channel swings right along the bluffs. And there's usually some hardwoods and cedars out there, and that's when that float and fly seems to work the best. The colder, the better. And you'll also notice that them shad, usually when they start to die, excuse me, is when the water has reached its coldest point and it's starting to warm back up. That's when them shad seem to start dying, which is normally sometime in February. But, late January, February, that's when the float and fly bite seems to be the best. So, again, thanks for all the good questions. Keep them coming. And until next week, good luck, good fishing.